Hello, Isaac.
Rabbi, good morning. So good to see you.
So good to see you. What an exciting time as we pound through these antitheses. We're starting a new one. We're going to probably the most famous one, sometimes called, the greatest commandments, which is generally viewed as loving God. But in Judaism, a lot of times it's viewed as loving one's enemies. And in Christianity, I think it's used both ways. And this definitely one is going to stick out in relation to other ones, as opposed to retaliation, swearing, adultery, divorce, and anger. This one will feel a little bit different, and we'll see. There's like the beginning is different and the end is different. So let's read the two verses and see how it goes from there.
Well, I'm looking forward. This is the last section on chapter 5. It feels like we've been in chapter 5 for a long time.
Oh my God, I didn't even notice how close we are to chapter 5.
The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 5, verse 43 onwards. You have heard that it was said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust.
Okay, let's call it a day, because we're not even going to do that last verse today. So, Isaac, based on your knowledge of the antitheses and the Sermon on the Mount, when a verse starts, you have heard that it was said. What does that mean, Isaac?
So it means that he's probably setting the law, and it's the what do you call it, the super he's setting up the law to point to a much higher standard.
Right.
You use a particular?
Oh yeah, I use a supererogation.
Supererogation.
But your first point I think is key, that he's citing the law, and when you mean the law, you mean the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. All the other citations were, for the most part, some form of citation from one of the books. But what's interesting over here is that if you look throughout the whole Bible, you will not find a verse that says, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." That does not exist. So this, I think, is our opening point. What is Jesus talking about? Is Jesus trying to quote a verse, or is he not trying to quote a verse? And if he's trying to quote a verse, why is he not quoting the verse accurate, which we've seen examples of this? And if he's not trying to quote the verse, why does he use the same opening that he uses in other places where he's trying to quote the verse?
Mm-hmm.
So I think Jesus, unless you want to pop out a possible answer, I think Jesus gets a lot of, or the Sermon on the Mount gets a lot of negative criticism for this. They're saying, well, scholars would be like, well, did Jesus really know the Bible by heart? Did Jesus cut and paste verses? And I want to argue that negativity that Jesus takes, which he's okay taking negativity. We read the end of Matthew. We know he's okay. I think that negativity is somewhat unjustified. I think when you look at the nature of the way the verses were floating around in the first century, number one, what you'll find is that now that we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that the Septuagint sometimes will have a more, I'll use the word authentic, or maybe historically more accurate interpretation of what the text might have been. The Mosaic text we have today sometimes is a better text, sometimes it's not. And that's not a inherent problem, number one. But number two, we see in the Talmud, which is going to be written significantly after this time period, that we see that Ben Sira, Ecclesiasticus, is cited as a verse. And while Ecclesiasticus, Sefer Ben Sira, will be included in some canons of the Christian, of the church, it's not included inside the canon of the Jewish people. And the 24 books of the Bible, the Tanakh, does not include Ben Sira. And yet we see verses cited. Not only that, when you look at Maimonides, which is already 1,000 years after this, and his citations for his Guide for the Perplexed, we see verses are chopped up, used a little differently, remembered differently. You have to always keep in mind that it's not easy. I don't know how many times you've picked up a scroll with the whole Bible. It's big, it's cumbersome, it's hard. It's not hard to move around, and to actually find a verse is not so easy. So I would argue that number one, Jesus has the right to cut and splice verses however the hell he wants. We are not going to be the ones to lob criticism at that. Number two, and his point is made more strongly with this verse. But number two, it could be this is how he remembered the verse, and that's fine too. That being said, we'll look at the verse in a second. I just want to give you.
And there's also a third option. My favorite option. Could this be the evangelist Matthew did, right? He wants all the symmetry, and so you have said, and he only put a part of the verse here. And maybe Jesus said the full verse, and maybe he didn't, maybe he used part of it. But the third option would also be that the evangelist only intentionally quoted only a part of the verse, probably to amplify, probably again to amplify or to accentuate a certain theme or the
So
certain
the
message.
amplification is definitely true. It amplifies the point. It's hard to believe when you see the negativity that was added that this was believed to every part of the verse. But let's see. So let's look at the verse. So you shall love your neighbor. Classic. Neighbor, as you know, historically just means love your fellow Israelite or your Jew. But it's nice in English when you hear neighbor, it doesn't feel as exclusive. So the verse in Leviticus that this is at least partially taken from does have negativity in it. And that's why I think there is the possibility that it was just swapped. So the actual verse says, you shall not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but you should love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So actively, the end of the verse was cut off. I am the Lord, because that seemed to be, I guess, unnecessary for the evangelist. But number two, the beginning of the verse, which kind of fits into Jesus' kind of good positive attitude. Don't take any vengeance. Don't hold grudges. If anything, we've seen this. Don't hold grudges. Don't hold anger. This almost sounds like the first antithesis in Matthew 5:21-26. But it only takes the middle one. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. And I think what our goal should be, like we've done probably through many of the antitheses, our goal today should probably be to compare and contrast how this part of the verse was interpreted in a rabbinic tradition versus how it's interpreted in Christian tradition, to try to see the revolutionary nature and or super arrogant nature of what Jesus is trying to say in comparison to the rabbinic tradition, while also coming out of the rabbinic tradition and being similar.
Thank you for that. So could we, on that note, could we also define some of these terms?
Sure.
Love, neighbor, hate, enemy. I think the author wants us to think certain things, but I think just for sake of clarity, given that these verses are based in the Torah, at least there, can we define love, neighbor, hate?
That's a great question, and I'm going to give you, unfortunately, a somewhat long answer. That when I was doing my master's thesis, my original topic was the idea of love in Maimonides' writing. And the fact that I could do a master's thesis and cite 50 books on the topic of what does it mean to love God shows you that I'm not going to be able to give you a competent answer of what it means to love your neighbor. I will say that one interesting commentary, he lives maybe 300 years ago, the Marsha, he notes that whenever you have a verse, you always have to look at it in its context. So he said, why would the context be love your neighbor? For example, with don't avenge and don't bear. Let me give you another devil's advocate read. Love your neighbor. Make sure to help his daughter get married, feed him on Sundays, and play with his kids. That would be examples of loving your neighbor. But what we see is the opposite. We see don't avenge, don't bear a grudge, and love your neighbor. And therefore, Maimonides probably, and the Marsha definitely said that what it means to love your neighbor is to make sure that you're not hurting them. The reason that this part of the verse, love your neighbor, shows up with those negative things is because those negative things are the way to love your neighbor. And the dictum is defined in what we shouldn't do. How you should love is not something that you could legislate. How can you prescribe to love someone? In Judaism, a lot of times we struggle. We say you should be happy at a wedding. What does that mean? And we try to give concrete ways. You should be sad at a funeral. We give concrete ways, but legislating of emotions and prescribing the way to carry out something internal is impossible. If anything, the idea of loving God and loving your neighbor is something that is inherently impossible to legislate, so much so that people start asking a question, practically, okay, what does it mean? Where if you get an emotive person, that emotive person might say, what do you mean? What do you mean by love God? I know exactly what that means. I know exactly how to love my neighbor. And only because you're crazy and you're too rational and you need to have legislation and you're too much in a box, do you need to know how to love God? That's not something I need legislated. If God says, love me, I know how to do that because I'm normal. So this is something that I think is very controversial about what it means to carry out a prescription of love God. And what if I told you this is not a prescription? It's an observation. You should love God, Isaac.
Yeah, so when you
Agreed.
see, love God, so this word love, my understanding is in the Greek there are four kinds of love, right? So in the Old Testament, like did they have a certain kind of love which matches with that, or did they love as in, because we probably use the word love in multiple ways. When I say I love my coffee, it's not quite the same thing as saying, that I love somebody. So just to we assume the word love for multiple things. I'm intrigued, like is yes, we can't legislate love. And yes, it's impossible to fully love God and fully love people all at the same time, or even just one or the other. But what is love? Is it the feeling of it, or could you define
So I think that your point, which is well taken, that Greek has four separate words for love for how it's carried out, is very true. But again, I think the kind of question you're asking is what a secondary source would ask on a primary source. The primary source knows exactly what it means, and I think you're expected to know. When the Marsha and the Rambam, the Maimonides says, well, maybe we should understand this and how to not hurt people. Maybe that's the most important way. And what we're going to see later on, I could skip to this even right now. What we're going to see later on is there's a lot of stories in Judaism about how various rabbis carried this out and even restructure it. So I'm going to go a little bit out of order, but let me tell you, because I want to tell you some of the, I think you'll find very entertaining interpretations of that verse. But let me tell you a story while we're doing that. So there once was an incident involving a certain non-Jew who came before Shammai. Shammai would have been a contemporary of Jesus. So this is a good time period. And he said to him, the non-Jew, convert me to Judaism on condition that you'll teach me the entire Torah, everything, while I stand on one foot. So I never interpreted this literally, but means chop, chop. I want to know it quickly. Upon hearing these words, Shammai pushed the person away with the ruler that was in his hand and, kind of slapped him. The person was, the non-Jew wasn't bothered, and he went in before Hillel, also contemporary of Jesus, and presented him with the same request: convert me while I stand on one foot. Hillel converted him on the spot. He disagreed with Jesus. With Shammai. Before the conversion, Hillel said to him, I'll tell you, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This, in a few words, is the entire Torah. And all the rest, everything else in the Torah is just its commentary, its elaboration of this one central point. Now go and learn it. So what we see from Hillel is an interpretation of this idea of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor like you love yourself. How does he interpret it? He interprets it in negative terms. Don't do to others what you don't want to do to yourself. So this seems to come out of the verse that it says, don't take a vengeance, don't bear a grudge, love your neighbor, that the very minimum relationship about how to have with someone is to not hurt them. I think this is generally what we associate with Satanism today. And if anything, this is what I've been more and more associating with America's lack of values, that the way to be a good person is to not hurt other people. It's not to make them stronger. It's not to lead them on the proper approach to be a good person, because there is no proper approach. So at the very minimum, you can't be destructive to other people. As long as you don't hurt people, then you're being a good person. And I think that's what Hillel is saying. The very base of Judaism, from a non-theological perspective, but from a human-to-human perspective, from an ethical perspective, is simply to not hurt other people. And then you can start go and learn the rest. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you. And so it sounds like hurt in the sense is defined only in terms of physical hurt.
To damage, to injure, to wrong.
Yeah, but so it doesn't speak about the psychological or the mental or the emotional health, right? Which is
well,
one can.
I think that's included. But the question you're supposed to ask is a good question, Isaac, is what kind of junk is Hillel telling us that it's only about ethical? What about love God? The great command that Christians have. The very fact that Hillel is saying the base of Judaism is just a moral and ethical base, and it's not theological. That's the question that everyone asks. And therefore you could say, like, maybe you can't really study about God until you're a good person. And there's a very strong tradition about this, that if you have an evil student, you shouldn't teach them. Evil students, you should turn away until they become good people. Once they're good people, then you start teaching them. Oh, but maybe they're not going to become a good person unless you teach them. Doesn't matter. So this is something that is a very famous, chicken what came first, the chicken or the egg. How can a person become a good person unless you teach them? So I keep not answering your question. I'm aware of that. There's no good interpretation of love. What I'm telling you is kind of how some people have dealt with it. But let me tell you some comical ones before we go to more stories. I think you'll like this. There's one I loved. Rabbi Yochanan was a Jew who lived in Israel, in Palestine at that time. And he said, Rabbi Yochanan said in the Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, what does it mean don't take vengeance and don't bear a grudge? It says every Talmid Chacham, every person who's a sage, a rabbi, that doesn't take vengeance and that doesn't bear a grudge, like a snake, militantly, bellicosely to it, is not a smart person. He's not a sage. He's not a rabbi. When it says don't take vengeance, it means only in matters of money. So when he says even this idea of don't take vengeance and don't bear a grudge, the rabbinic Judaism shoots down. There's a time for vengeance. There's a time for grudge. And that time is whenever, as from a pedagogical perspective, you have an obligation to lead people in the right path, to have a values-driven life, you have to take vengeance. Oh, this person wronged me and he's not going to learn a lesson. I must take vengeance in the name of God, not in my own name. And the way to v'ahavta l'erecha kamocha, the way to love your neighbor, is to take vengeance. The reason that it says don't take vengeance and don't bear a grudge is to tell you that usually in theological matters, in money matters, you don't. You shouldn't just punish someone because they owe you money. But in matters that make someone a good person, you have to make sure to do that. So that's one interpretation I thought you would love, to show you that Jesus would laugh at this. Jesus would say, no, you're going the wrong way. It's not that it's saying there is a time to have a grudge. He would say there's probably never a time to have a grudge. And the way to fulfill loving your neighbor is to make sure that if you even have the smallest iota of a possibility. So rabbinic tradition goes the opposite way, that they're together to teach you that you should bear a grudge. You should avenge when it's the name of God. And I guess that's a very classic crusader attitude, right?
Yeah, and it's also, would you say, it's also a very fine distinction, right? There are places where he speaks of courage and speak the truth and do this, but then he's saying, now don't take grudge. And so, by virtue of courage, for courage to exist, right? It's more about, it's not as an evil in the abstract, but, again, it's more embodied thing. And so it's more, one's motivations could be driven either by, the way I read this is it's more about one's motivations. One's motivations could either be driven by hate, by grudge, or by wanting to do a good thing. And so he's saying, he's saying, check your motivations. So even if the harm done is not driven by the hate of the other person, but maybe sometimes the most loving thing to do to a person is to tell them, painful things. That's just what life is.
It's interesting how Jesus did this. So yeah. I don't have any translations of this, so I'm just going to translate off the top of it. I'm just going to read you 5 quick translations of attitudes of love your neighbor like yourself. Again, this is more for your entertainment, to give you the rabbinic perspective. I think you're going to love this stuff because it's comical if you haven't heard it. But I'm just going to translate. So if it sounds a little funny, I'll do my best. Okay. Love your neighbor like you love yourself. This teaches you that when you execute someone, you should execute them with a knife to the neck, because it should be a good death. You wouldn't want a bad death. Love your neighbor like you love yourself. Make sure they get a swift death. That's number 1. Number 2, Rabbi Judah says name of Rav. It's forbidden to get engaged and marry a woman until you physically see her at least for one moment. Why? Because you might find her gross or ugly. And the Torah says, love your neighbor like you love yourself. You shouldn't marry a person just be set up, and first time you see her is under the marriage canopy. Love your neighbor like you love yourself. Okay, let me do 2. There's 10 more. Let me do a couple more just so you hear. Love your neighbor like you love yourself. They taught you should a son is not allowed to hit his father, but he is allowed to let blood, because they believe that was medically beneficial. That means you have to cut your dad. Why are you allowed to cut your dad in order to do this minor surgery or this medically beneficial thing? Love your neighbor like you love yourself. And the last one, which last 2, which are like comical, it is forbidden to have relations with your wife during the day. Why? Love your neighbor like you love yourself, and you might find that she is gross You'll see some stuff you don't like seeing during the day. And therefore only at night. And last one, the most famous one we'll look at in a second separately. Rabbi Kiva, this is the most famous one. He lived, a good 70 years after Jesus. Zehu klal gadol b'Torah. This is the great principle of the Torah, that you should love your neighbor like you love yourself. Okay, I wanted to give you that list to show that this is a topic that Jews were struggling with. This is something that they want to make sure that if you have something in the Bible that has meaning, this verse is something you have to make sure to internalize and have it. If it means don't always look at your wife in good light, literally, or maybe it means make sure to not override a verse in the Bible that says don't hurt your father, in order to tell you that it's okay to hurt your father in order to help your father. So there's all these ideas of how does one love your neighbor? So the question that you had, to say it succinctly, what is the demand of this verse? To love your neighbor. And this is something that Jesus was now, let me just close my door. That's something that Jesus himself was struggling with. Okay, let's keep going on. I want to give you one more story. And then, no, we're not up to one more story. So let's go back to the verse and see how Jesus was doing it differently. So number one, you shall love your neighbor and not hate your enemy. So hate your enemy. Don't hate your enemy. While it's not a biblical verse, it does show up. Like you're supposed to hate certain people. It does show up in Psalms 137 and other places, even though it's not a verse. So it's not crazy. Yeah.
So thank you for the background and for all the stories. So love your neighbor is one thing, hate your enemy is another thing. What is the need for both? Why not just stop this with love your neighbor? Like, was it a need to say, and don't hate your enemy? Isn't that by definition, as in love your neighbor includes everyone?
Well, I think it's like I think you answered the question earlier on, that they wanted to set up a dichotomy, that it's not only love your neighbor, it's like you can't and hate your enemy, that this is the lower level, that this idea definitely existed in Psalms. We definitely have this idea about Amalek, that you're supposed to, there's a group of evil people that you're supposed to genocidally kill. There's all these ideas of there are people you're supposed to hate. And I think Jesus set this up as like, here is the Judaism that I am experiencing in the first century. There's love your neighbor. And I gave you a bunch of different interpretations. Maybe his was like, be good to Jews, whatever, be good to everyone, who knows? But then there's also an idea of hate bad people or hate your enemy or whatever. And that was an acceptable idea in the first century. So I think that sets up our foundation, our plateau for Jesus to be super arrogative. And what does he say? But I say to you, in contradiction, not only should you love your neighbor, but you should love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. So the extra level is that Jesus always has an active level of going one step further. Right. So, for example, when you should never swear, but if you don't even say more than yes, yes, no, no. And if they say go 1 mile, you should go the second mile. And over here, the worst, like if you believe prayer is efficacious, and we should at least believe that Jesus' prayer should be efficacious, that he believes that, then the worst thing you could do is pray for your enemy. It's absolutely destructive to you. By praying for your enemy, you're hurting yourself. Put aside the emotional damage that you do when you pray for your enemy. Oh, Hitler, I hope you have a long, great life. That's horrible. You know, all you want is your enemy.
So that's the difference between praying for them and blessing them, right? When you say, so one could also pray, on this topic of Hitler, right? If one prayed, God, can Hitler come see the truth, just the ignorance of his ideas? Is that an acceptable prayer? I think when you say for long life, right, that's more as blessing someone versus praying versus praying for someone.
So you're trying to make a distinction between prayer and blessing. So if I had to make up a difference on the spot, I'd say prayer. I think these are big philosophical concepts. So what I'm saying is not true from all angles, I'll recognize. But mostly, I say colloquially, the way that human beings think of prayer, it's that asking God to intercede. There, of course, is prayer that's recognizing God. There's God that's thanking God. But when it's saying in this context, prayer means there's an intercession of God saying like, God, this is the reality. And I would prefer if it turned a little bit differently.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So I'm a bit hard pressed to accept it because we've discussed that the highest form of prayer is to bless God's name. You know, that's the highest form of prayer is to bless God's name. And
that's one approach.
But isn't that the highest form of prayer?
I mean, there's Maimonides quotes very famously, the greatest praise of God is silence, because there's no possible way to really praise God in a meaningful way, considering the vast chasm that separates you in your reality from God's reality. So, but that is more a philosophical, hyper-rationalistic attitude. Generally, prayer, the more emotive you are, the more you feel you could ask God to intercede anything. There are people who pray to God every 10 seconds because they want to get an extra crumb on their plate. It's just different attitudes towards prayer. But over here, I just want to point out how crazy it is what Jesus is saying. We'll use the word revolutionary, because if you pray for your enemies to be successful, and if your enemies are actually hurting you, what you're actually praying for is for yourself to be hurt, but you're recognizing that even if you get hurt, it's still part of God's will and beneficial. So Jesus is going really, really past. It's not only if you believe in prayer, it's not he's saying, oh, like if I say, Isaac, pray for your enemies, I'm not sure I'm going to believe that all your prayers are going to be answered. But what Jesus is saying is that it's okay if your enemies are successful and hurt you. And this is what we see, turn your cheek. There's this idea that Jesus is totally open, and this is definitely foreshadowing the future, but Jesus is open to intimately hurting yourself, damaging your physical and mental well-being in order to be a good person or to service God correctly. And I think this is a great example of turning the cheek, walking the extra mile, and praying for, this is another example, praying for your enemies, because this hurts you.
Yeah. Yes. So I think as I'm just thinking on this seems to be a common theme with the other sections also, wherein oath-taking retaliation is it's pointing to the deep sovereignty of God. And it's to say that there is a world beyond what we can see with our eyes. And he's pointing to this deeper world where it's a different way. It's not cause and effect, but placed by some different rules. And in a sense, it kind of fits with this broad themes, as in when he answers Pilate, right, towards the end, as in, it's not you're doing, but who gave this to you. He's again pointing to this deeper world, or this invisible world. So from that sense, from that perspective, these three sections, they kind of blend in when you look at this longer. But but on the face of it, when you say love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, it does sound like very unhealthy. Because what does it mean to even pray, right? What does it mean to pray? I mean, when people hurt somebody, which hurt to mean, it could be multiple forms: physical, emotional, psychological. So on the face of it, it sounds like this is going nowhere, but one also accepts that he's pointing to this deeper truth of sovereignty of God, and what you pray you can pray, the prayer only changes you. That gives this verse a much more richer meaning. But here's what I would like to get your thoughts on. So we've discussed that he's pointing to this deeper world, this world of God, which is not seen. Was that acceptable within Judaism, to say that there is a world which we cannot see? There is a world we cannot see. And
that is Judaism, no? The whole idea of Pharisaic Judaism versus probably Sadducean Judaism is that the Pharisaic Judaism accepts the invisible world a lot more. Like everyone in this time period is going to accept there's a God and whatever he's doing, whatever. But the question is, at what level are humans like served? Like, do humans go to heaven? Is there prophecy? All these things are going to be totally, I think, common and normal. Okay. Let me tell you one last story, because I thought you'll like it. So the question is, was Jesus going out on the line by saying pray for the wicked? So here's a good story. This is from Tractate Brachos in the Babylonian Talmud 10a. So there was a certain bore, our favorite word, a certain bore in Rabbi Meir's neighborhood. Rabbi Meir was a student of Rabbi Akiva, the guy who we mentioned. And that person caused a tremendous amount of stress and annoyance to Rabbi Meir. Once Rabbi Meir was going to pray for him that he should die. This is one of the things that from the storytelling perspective of rabbis, a lot of times they have the power to pray for someone to die and they die, or they pray for someone to be resuscitated and resurrected, and that happens. This is from the storyteller's perspective, something that rabbis have the ability. So when it says he's going to pray from the die, it's not just innocuous. He prays from the die, he's going to die. And he thought, in other words, he's executing him. He's giving a death sentence to him. So Rabbi Meir's wife, Bruria, a very famous wife in the Talmud, she says, what is the reason to pray for their death? And so it's explained because it's written in a verse in Psalms. It says, the sinners, yitamu chataim, the sinners will cease from the earth. So you're saying, you believe that King David wanted the sinners to cease from the earth. So when you pray for this person to die, you're kind of fulfilling what King David meant in Psalms. But is it then the word chotim that is written in the verse? In which case the verse would refer to sinners? No, it doesn't mean sinners. Rather, it's written that it's chataim, which means the evil inclination, which means the evil inclination will cease from the earth according to Berea, but not that sinners will cease from the earth. And furthermore, she says, go down to the end of the verse, and what it says, and let the wicked be no more. Now, it's definitely the case that once sinners cease from the world, the wicked will be no more, right? Obviously. Therefore, you should pray for mercy, pray for him that he'll repent. And if you pray for him to repent, then the evil inclination will have no impact on him. You'll fulfill what King David said, that there'll be no inclination. And in the absence of any inclination, the wicked will indeed be no more. So there's two attitudes towards eliminating evil people. One, kill them. In other words, help them become better persons. And I think what Jesus is saying over here is very much taking the Rabbi Meir's wife's attitude, namely, how can you remove evil from the world? What should you do? One way to remove evil from the world is to execute people. Hate what the verse says, hate your enemy. Do everything you can to make them unsuccessful. But then Bruria, Rav Meir's wife, says to Rav Meir, that's not right. What King David never thought you should eliminate bad people. That's not that. You should eliminate the evil inclination. And there's only one way to really eliminate the evil inclination, by praying for them, by helping them. That's what Rav Meir did. And that's what I think Jesus is saying here. I think this is a perfect parallel, that there's an argument in the first century about what do you do with bad people? Isaac, you see a Hitler out there.
The more
you see a bad person. What do you do?
Yeah, what do? You say you pray for them that they come.
So Jesus saw in the first century, he saw that, again, it's not that as a verse, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. That's what he saw. He saw Rabbi Meir's perspective. But what do you hate your enemy? Pray for him to die. Do anything to hurt him. And Jesus comes along and says, no, Bruria is right. Bruria actually lived like 50 years after Jesus. So whatever, for a second. But he says, I agree with Bruria. Bruria is saying that the way to make the world a better place is not to give up on people. It's to take those evil people and pray for them. And pray for them could be a metaphor for helping them, making sure you do everything you can. Ask God to intercede on their behalf, give them charity, kill them with love.
If I can pick one thing, I wish I had the ability where when you pray, people would die. That's at least the way you said this.
And just to give you additional context, there's a prayer called the 18 prayers that Jews say 3 times a day. It's the most common prayer. It's the main part prayer. It's called the 18 prayers, even though there are 19 prayers in it, which is funny. The reason there are 19 because Rabban Gamliel, end of the first century, he said that there's too many heretics, and he prayed for the dissolution of the heretics, that they should be cut off. I don't know why he was killed, but they should cease to exist. And again, I think this was a very common attitude in the first century, that we say the scoffers, the haters, the heretics, what should you do with them? Just cut them off. And I think this is something that Christianity struggles with, right? Because I think over Christianity's last 2,000 years, the attitude towards the heretics has been mixed at best. Because on the one hand, you want to say, Jesus says, pray for the evil, help them out. Do what you can to make them. Hit your face, hit the other way. Do anything you can to help them. But then on the other hand, in the first century, there was this attitude that you got to cut off the cancerous leg of your body. And if that cancerous leg is the heretics, you got to get rid of them. That was definitely Judaism's attitude. If anything, we see sectarianism, including Christianity, is a product of first century Judaism, that there's so many different groups breaking off because there's this attitude that I can't live with you anymore. You are truly not my neighbor. You are not of the same religion as me. And if anything, Christianity, you could view it as a rejection of the way that Judaism was. And if anything, it was that you are no longer my neighbor. The parting of the ways that took place between the 2nd and 4th century until, without a doubt, Christianity was his own religion in its own right in all levels, was, if anything, a rejection of the Pharisaic and Talmudic traditions, and the Jewish people saying, we are no longer with you, aka we are no longer your neighbor. You are different from us. And again, you could argue that this is something that Jesus would have either had a different attitude towards, or definitely would have had a lot to comment on had he lived through the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, let alone through the Middle Ages.
It's a lot to think about, when you point to this invisible world and the way this plays out my daily life, and in some ways it's easy to label people as being enemies or friends or neighbors, right? Because we love labels, but by pointing to a deeper world, he's saying that trust in the sovereignty of God. That is, at least from a, it's a very fine, it's a subtle distinction.
Isaac, I want you to walk down the street in New York City, find your enemies one by one, find the racists, find the capitalists, find the communists, find all the people who you don't identify with, and just give them hugs.
Well, but they aren't my enemies. What if my enemies aren't really? Well, I don't view them as my enemies per se. I think anyway. So but that's a much bigger discussion. But Rabbi, this has been great. I think it's helpful to see the parallels between these three sections, between oath taking, retaliation, and now enemies, where it's all pointing to this deeper, invisible world and being mindful of. The more I read this, I go, what is Christianity's unique contribution from Judaism? It feels like as I read this, they all have a basis in Judaism. Some rabbis have said this, and he's taking pieces of this and putting this together. And I go, okay, then in what way is this actually different? But that's
I would add that Christianity's unique contribution to religion and the world is not actually what we're studying so much. We're kind of really doing more biblical exegesis. Mm-hmm. And I think that we very easily could transition at one point and say, here are the 10,000 things that Christianity both took from and expanded and added to the world to show the contribution. So I would say that it's very easy to talk about that. It's just not what we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thank you for the clarification. I get the takeaway that Christianity is so deeply embedded within Judaism. At least this Matthean Christianity.
At least Jesus is.
At least Jesus is. That's right. Yeah. Okay. Well, Rabbi, on that note, thank you. Thanks for your time and discussion. This has been great. Lots of things. Have a great Shabbos.
You too. Okay. Thanks so much. Goodbye.